that better coordinates its field agencies and that more faithfully represents the diversity of peoples across the globe. Panama has offered to host offices of United Nations system organizations to support reform efforts under the UN 80 initiative. I also wish today to express my solidarity with the Japanese people. This on the occasion of the 23rd anniversary of North Korea's admission of its abduction of at least 17 Japanese nationals. The world needs to know the truth so that these events are never repeated, and Japan deserves justice. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot let this opportunity pass without highlighting that we have now completed a quarter century since our canal was transferred into Panamanian hands. As of the 31st of December 1999, the Republic of Panama took up the works and operations of the canal efficiently, safely, sustainably, and neutrally. This in accordance with the Panama Canal Treaty, Torrijos Carta Treaty, and the Permanent Neutrality Treaty, which were both signed in 1977. Since then, we have administered the waterway in exemplary fashion, contributed to the country's economic development, and operated the canal for the benefit of international navigation. Over this period, Panama expanded the interoceanic route using our own resources to meet the demand of larger vessels. Now we are taking another step forward. We are supporting the Panama Canal Authority in the development of the Rio Indio Reservoir. This is an ambitious project to ensure water supply for our population and the canal, so that vessel traffic is not threatened by recurring droughts in our region. Our waterway serves more than 180 maritime routes and more than 140 nations, and approximately 4% of global trade passes through it. We are committed to ensuring efficiency in support of international logistics. Before this assembly, Panama once again reaffirms its serious and sustained commitment to the regime established under the treaty concerning permanent neutrality, to which the protocol of which numerous states have adhered to. Neutrality is the best formula to safeguard the security of our canal, a global public good. The Panama Canal is neutral, open to the world, and a facilitator of more integrated international trade. It is and shall remain Panamanian. Ladies and gentlemen, Panama, as you know, holds a non-permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council for the 2025-2026 term. This past August, we held the rotating presidency of the Security Council. We viewed this role as a responsibility to maintain a strong voice in favor of peace, sovereign equality of states, justice, international law, and respect for agreements among nations. We have also stressed the importance of maritime security as a priority during our participation in the Council. Panama's national identity is closely linked to maritime transport. Over the centuries, we have consolidated our role as a key actor in navigation and international trade. Piracy, arms and drugs trafficking, and illegal fishing all affect trade and the global maritime transport system. As a transit nation and a logistics hub in our continent, Panama proposes to strengthen cooperation among specialized agencies, including through a regional network to promote maritime security. This would operate under the umbrella of ocean governance and in accordance with international law. I wish to reiterate before this assembly the work that this organization needs to undertake to mitigate the effects of illegal migration driven by organizations that are either directly or indirectly linked to drugs trafficking. For years, millions of people have been passing through our Darien region, which is on our border with Colombia. And yet, in just 1 year in office, we've reduced the flow of migrants heading north to zero. That crisis was resolved, thus meeting the promise to shut down illegal crossings through the Darien. The humanitarian and environmental consequences were extreme. The suffering of women and children subjected to abuse and the pollution of one of the world's most biodiverse areas. These continue to cause pain to those of us who have had direct contact with the situation. Today, we are seeing north-south migration on a much smaller scale, but which renews our commitment to the orderly transit of people so that they may return home. I must say that while the migratory crisis has been resolved, the causes of mass emigration remain unaddressed. The fact that our country has resolved this scourge doesn't mean that we should let up in our demands for concrete responses, such as in the case of the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which is facing unchecked migration that also has an effect on the entire region. It's essential that we find clear solutions both for the Haitian crisis and more generally for effective control of migratory flows. We are currently suffering from the growth of another illegal activity, which is drug trafficking. Today, it poses a threat to human lives and a grave risk of instability throughout the entire region due to the different cartels operating there. Just to give you a quick idea, this year alone, Panama has seized nearly 150 tons of cocaine and other drugs. This is an historic and alarming figure, one which compels us to step up our efforts to seek greater cooperation and to galvanize resources in a struggle that must be a common cause among all nations of the world. Honorable members, next year, the Amphictyonic Congress of Panama, convened by the liberator Simón Bolívar, will celebrate its bicentenary. Its proposal was for an international system based on the sovereign equality of states, justice, law, and international cooperation to achieve the people's common goals. We hope that this commemoration will serve as a new starting point for international cooperation, one that respects and elevates the values of sovereignty, peace, and peaceful coexistence, values that must guide our work in this and other global fora. Honorable members, before this forum of global peace and international cooperation, I reiterate the faith of the Panamanian people in the United Nations system. At times of crisis, when the winds of unilateralism, polarization, and fragmentation are blowing, Panama will raise its voice in defense of multilateralism. Panama will remain an enthusiastic member of the United Nations, a defender of international law, and a tireless proponent of global peace. Because, as this year's theme reminds us, we are stronger together, and only together can we build a fairer and more humane future for all. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Panama. As the Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Peter Pavel, President of the Czech Republic, I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am humbled to speak here in front of you again. Today, I wish to address two main issues: United Nations achievements and necessity of its reform, and prospect of multilateralism in the light of Russian aggression. 80 years ago, the United Nations was founded with great hope to prevent war and destruction, never to repeat the horrors of World War II. My country proudly stood amongst the founding nations, signing the charter that would become our collective moral compass. Since 1945, we have witnessed remarkable achievements. The United Nations helped to prevent another full-scale world conflict. It assisted in dissolution of colonialism and rise of new sovereign countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Together, we created a robust multilateral system of rules and global cooperation in international security, human rights, and economic development. Together with the UN, we have fought famine, disease, illiteracy, and poverty in some of the world's most vulnerable regions. Dozens of peacekeeping missions have helped to ease tensions in conflict zones. Thanks to its long-standing efforts, the UN has helped transform countless lives and laid the groundwork for a better world, a world which is more humane and more cooperative. It provided a platform where even the smallest nations can speak out and be heard. The UN remains the only institution where the world can collectively confront global crises. Not with weapons, but with dialogue, shared responsibility, and pressure where necessary. UN's greatest achievement is not perfection, it's persistence. With many devastating conflicts ongoing, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has significantly transformed the global security landscape. Since the last general debate a year ago, our world has not become more secure. On the contrary. In the game of smoke and mirrors, Russia continues targeting civilians, civilian infrastructure, foreign diplomatic missions, and most recently, even our neighboring country, Poland. Not to forget the acts of hybrid warfare on our own territory. These range from disinformation campaigns and attempts to undermine public trust, to cyber attacks, and even acts of sabotage carried out by mercenaries recruited online. Despite being the largest country on the map, Russia that help it circumvent sanctions and provide economic or political support. Russia, a permanent member of UN Security Council, is not only violating the principles of state sovereignty and territorial integrity enshrined in the UN Charter, but also sets a dangerous example and precedent, sending the message that aggression can yield territorial and political gain and remain unpunished. Ladies and gentlemen, our multilateral system was created on the premise that rules apply to all without exception. The consequences of this war go far beyond the news headlines. This war threatens to dismantle our system of governance based on mutual respect, equal partnership, and rules we all subscribe to. What is happening in Europe today could happen anywhere else tomorrow, under different circumstances, but under the exact same pretext. If Russia wins this unjust war, it will legitimize the triumph of brute force. Turning a blind eye to Ukraine today is a green light to any future aggressor anywhere in the world. Disruptions of the status quo in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific would further destabilize global security and trade. Geographical distance offers no protection. Security in one part of the world is directly linked to security everywhere. Tolerating the principle of might makes right will lead to the end of multilateralism and the beginning of life under principles dictated by a powerful few. It would be a future with history deliberately rewritten, with lies promoted as facts, and with truth slowly disappearing from our discourse and memory. Just the opposite of what most of our nations fought for in the previous century. The heroism of Ukrainian people, their willingness to sacrifice for freedom, and global solidarity with Ukraine demonstrate that most of us still believe in universal values and in our responsibility to defend them. To achieve sustainable peace, we democratic allies from all over the world must act in unity and intensify our economic pressure on Russia. This is the only way to bring the aggressor to the negotiating table. Such peace, based on the existing international law, including territorial integrity and the right of self-determination, is in the interest of not only European countries, but of the whole international community. Any future peace agreement must send a clear message worldwide that aggressor must not be rewarded and borders cannot be changed by force. Ladies and gentlemen, the structure of the UN was based on the outcome of the World War II. Today, one of the UN Security Council permanent members is waging a ruthless war while obstructing any constructive solutions put forward. It is in light of these new geopolitical realities that we need a strong and effective UN system capable of responding to today's global challenges, from security threats and climate change to rapid evolution of new technologies. Otherwise, we risk sliding into a world that is more fragmented, more dangerous, and far less predictable. Czechia welcomes the UN 80 initiative and the commitments in the Pact for Future. Yet these ambitions stand in stark contrast with today's reality. In the light of Russian aggression against Ukraine, the UN Security Council is currently failing its purpose and mission. Therefore, we advocate for a comprehensive reform of the UN Security Council for greater effectiveness, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability, with the aim to honor the principles of the UN Charter and to strengthen the voice of underrepresented regions. Freedom and human rights are not granted entitlements. They are hard-won principles that must be cherished and protected. Security Council membership should not be seen as a matter of prestige or privilege, but above all, a responsibility to defend global peace. That's why Czechia is seeking a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council for the term 2032-33, with a clear commitment to uphold the rules-based international order. We cannot afford to have the UN paralyzed or blocked in its ability to respond to crises and challenges. Current urgent crises are already consuming too much of our attention and resources at the expense of other major, equally pressing issues. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned in the beginning of my speech, the UN significantly improved the quality of life of billions, including through access to education, healthcare, and services. In this year's Sustainable Development Report, Czechia ranked 10th out of 167 countries. I am fortunate to be a citizen of a country which by global standards offers a secure and comfortable life. This doesn't mean that there are no challenges. Much work still lies ahead if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, both at home and globally. After all, most of the challenges we are facing are global. No single nation is powerful enough to succeed alone. That is why we need more dialogue. That is why we need greater cooperation and collective action. And ultimately, that is why multilateralism must not only survive, it must thrive. Not only for us, but most importantly, for future generations. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Czech Republic. The Assembly will hear an address by Her Excellency Karen Keller-Sutter, President of the Swiss Confederation. I request protocol to escort Her Excellency and invite her to address the Assembly.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 80 years ago, the world entered a new era, better times. On the 27th of January, 1945, the Auschwitz concentration camp was liberated. On the 8th of May, 1945, the war in Europe ended, and on 25 June 1945, 50 states adopted the United Nations Charter in San Francisco. And I quote from the charter, they were determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. End of quote. Upon the ruins of the Second World War, a new international order was born out of a shared conviction and determination to bring peace and prosperity to the world. The horrors of this time also gave rise to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which protect the victims of armed conflict. At that time, the foundations for progress and democracy, the rule of law, and the market economy were laid down. Foundations which, despite all the limitations and setbacks, also benefited international cooperation, free trade, peace, and international law. Without drawing any historical parallels, it is clear that this year, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, we are experiencing a new era of particularly extreme political and economic upheaval at a time when, once again, too many wars are raging with civilian populations experiencing unbearable suffering, a time in which a just lasting peace in the Middle East and Ukraine still seems beyond reach, and during which autocratic tendencies are gaining ground, including in Europe, a time in which free trade is being put to the test, and where ultimately international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, risk becoming dead letter. These upheavals are not coming out of nowhere. They are the result of developments that, in some cases, date back a long time, in which, in retrospect, we failed to take seriously enough for far too long. We need to be honest with ourselves. These are developments that have no simple solutions, neither at the international nor at the national levels, nor is it enough today to reiterate yet again, merely in speeches, the merits of a particular form of government, the rule of law, international law, free trade, and multilateralism. No, if we wish to surmount the challenges which we face, we have a duty to redouble our efforts. For what is the benefit of the achievements of civilization? What are they worth if they do not tangibly contribute to freedom, security, and prosperity, if they do not bring tangible benefits for people in their day-to-day lives? There are two errors which we must not make. Firstly, pointing the finger only at others. Secondly, leaving international organizations alone to work alone and acting as if they were completely detached from us. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to begin where we can guarantee freedom and contribute to security and prosperity right now. And generally, this is at home, within our own countries. Let me be clear, this is not about praising national self-interest, nor is this about condemning multilateralism. Quite to the contrary, Switzerland is convinced that multilateralism, international organizations, the United Nations are essential for the peaceful coexistence of peoples, for global economic prosperity, for the resolution of challenges, including migration, climate change, the digital transition, and as finance minister, I would also add for global financial stability. Last year, we together adopted the Pact for the Future, a robust commitment to multilateralism. A central pillar of the Pact is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We must now implement these roadmaps without delay. Switzerland is also convinced that International Geneva can make a unique contribution to the attainment of these goals. Geneva, as the United Nations leading operational center, has robust expertise in numerous crucial areas for our future, particularly those related to humanity and innovation. This is a unique unparalleled ecosystem for reflection, discussion, and concerted action. But a strong international organization needs strong members. And when I say strong, I do not mean strength in terms of size or strength in terms of military might. I am talking about states that are in a position to provide their citizens with an environment in which they're able to flourish and to express themselves freely and in complete safety and security. Security not just in the military sense, but also at the legal, economic, and social security level. Security and freedom are essential prerequisites for economic growth and therefore for prosperity. They require institutions that are legally sound, reliable, and capable of taking action, and they require political, social, and financial stability. And here, each state has an obligation to shoulder its own responsibilities. We cannot simply delegate our responsibilities to an international organization. Ladies, gentlemen, the international community cannot but benefit from the domestic strength, prosperity, and stability of each state. Only strong states, strong domestically, can demonstrate true solidarity and contribute to a successful, prosperous international community. But we need to also redouble our efforts as an international community. Today, more than ever before, the United Nations must also take a critical look at itself to consider whether it is still able to fulfill its role as the 50 states intended when they adopted the charter in San Francisco on 25 June 1945. Multilateralism is also undergoing unprecedented upheaval. These upheavals are punctuated by a resurgence of violations in the normative framework and the very principles and values that underpin multilateral action. Dialogue, cooperation, consensus building, respect for international law, and sovereign equality of states, regardless of size, of economic strength, or political influence. Switzerland calls upon all states to make a firm commitment to uphold the principles and values enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations 80 years ago. This is the prelude to any reflection on reforms and efficiency measures to strengthen the impact of our actions in the three pillars of the organization. With this in mind, we fully support the UN 80 reform program of the Secretary General. A greater effectiveness, coherence, agility, and impact of multilateral action should each guide our decisions. A structured, well-thought-through approach together for defining the UN of the future is vital. I can assure you that Switzerland will continue to work towards reform. We remain committed to the reform efforts to a more effective and efficient United Nations and to sustainable multilateralism, both as a reliable host state and as a committed member state. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are not in the same situation today as we were 80 years ago. We are in the midst of a critical phase, and the next chapter of history is yet to be written. This also means that we can play an active role in shaping it. And I quote an Auschwitz survivor, the Italian writer Primo Levi, "It happened, therefore it could happen again. This is the core of what we have to say." End of quote. But it doesn't have to happen again. And indeed, it must not happen again. This is why the United Nations was created 80 years ago. And this is also why we are here today. It is up to us to ensure that this turning point in history, which is so often invoked, as was the case 80 years ago, for this to usher in a new era of better times. Let us guard against arrogance and complacency, and let us get to work at home, in our countries, and together at the United Nations. Thank you.
Merci. I thank, on behalf of the Assembly, the President of the Swiss Confederation. The Assembly will hear now an address by His Excellency Edgars Rinkēvičs, President of the Republic of Latvia. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. First of all, allow me to congratulate Your Excellency, Madam Annalena Baerbock, on assuming the presidency of the General Assembly. You will have Latvia's full cooperation. Latvia believes that we are stronger together, stronger in advancing peace, fostering development, upholding human rights. Standing here on this world stage, I would like to congratulate us on the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. 80 years working together to build a better, more just and peaceful world. This task has never been easy, but it is our duty to persist with determination and give our very best. I want to express Latvia's gratitude for the overwhelming support for our candidacy for the United Nations Security Council. We are beginning our term next year. This is our first term. Latvia will take on this responsibility with a strong sense of duty, a duty to serve with integrity, transparency, and with a clear commitment to the principles of the United Nations. Latvia is honored to serve on the Security Council for the good of people around the world. And we will stand together for peace and resilience. Latvia's three priorities in the Security Council are: first, protect our rules-based international order. Second, advocate for women, peace, and security agenda. Also protect the most vulnerable people amongst us. Third, find solutions to emerging security threats. These include climate change, hybrid threats, the challenges related to the safety of artificial intelligence. Excellencies, the world is in disarray. Before our eyes, we see blatant attempts to weaken or even to destroy the rules-based international order, the order that is rooted in the United Nations Charter. In effect, a new world order is emerging, and it is not a better one. There is an attempt to recreate the world where the might makes right. The permanent members of the Security Council undertook to maintain international peace and security, to prevent wars, to prevent devastation and loss of life, But it seems that one permanent member, Russia, doesn't want this. Russia wants a world where brute force prevails over international law. Russia does not want peace. Russia wants to get what it wants. And Russia is willing to inflict destruction and misery on others. Unfortunately, Russia has partners in crime, notably Iran and North Korea. Ukraine is fighting back, bravely, with all it has. Ukraine is facing an existential threat to its people, to its land, to its freedom. Ukraine is fighting for all of us, for the rules-based international order, for independence and sovereignty, for territorial integrity, so that international borders are not changed by force. These actually are the very principles at heart of the United Nations. Latvia stands with Ukraine and will advocate for its sovereignty and territorial integrity at the United Nations Security Council. We are and we will be advocates for Ukrainian children abducted by Russia. They must be returned. We will be advocates for the Ukrainian civilians who have lost their homes and livelihoods. Latvia will use its position on the United Nations Security Council to help achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. I want to express my appreciation to President Trump, President Zelensky, and my European colleagues for their efforts to achieve peace, for trying to stop the unnecessary destruction and the misery we are witnessing in Ukraine. It is our collective duty to uphold the principles of the United Nations Charter, especially when a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council openly violates them. We need no reminding that the United Nations was founded on the ruins of the World War II, to save future generations from the scourge of war, to maintain international peace and security, to protect human life. Distinguished delegates, in war, it is the most innocent that pay the highest price. It is our duty to strengthen international cooperation to tackle the escalating crisis in Gaza. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza continues to spiral. Urgent action is needed to end civilian suffering. Latvia condemns all terrorist attacks. Nothing can justify terrorism. We recognize Israel's legitimate right to self-defense, but it must be exercised in line with the international law and particularly international humanitarian law. The law is there to protect every one of us. Latvia calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The terrorist organization Hamas must release all hostages. Hamas must be destroyed, as this organization is responsible for so much human suffering in the region. We need to ensure that the access to humanitarian aid in Gaza is safe and unconditional. The ongoing escalation confirms the need for a sustainable political solution, the need for a two-state solution in accordance with international parameters, the need to break the cycle of violence, to reach a just and lasting peace, a peace that addresses the security concerns and the legitimate aspirations of both the Israelis and Palestinians. Latvia is keenly aware of the ongoing conflicts around the world. We must work together to resolve the dire humanitarian situation in Sudan and Democratic Republic of the Congo. We will not look on helplessly as crises unfold. As a member of the Security Council, we will call on the international community to take collective action and to facilitate humanitarian aid, to try to end unnecessary human suffering. Distinguished delegates, we must do everything in our power to protect the most vulnerable people, especially women and children. Women and girls suffer disproportionately in times of war. We, the global community, have a responsibility to protect the rights of women and girls, to empower them, to ensure their voices are heard in peace processes. The first deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia is beyond disturbing. We call on the United Nations to do more, do much more. We will do all we can to help bring these children home. Madam President, it is not only conventional warfare that threatens peace, security, and stability. Emerging threats like climate change, cyber attacks, hybrid attacks, and the misuse of the artificial intelligence are testing us on a daily basis. Our modern world is connected in ways that most of us can't imagine. Today, many countries are experiencing a growing wave of hybrid attacks, also Latvia. We have to deal with damage to undersea cables, GPS jamming, arson attacks, the Russian shadow fleets. Russia continues and actually invests in new provocations, most recently recklessly violating the airspace of Poland and Estonia. The intensity of Russia's drone attacks against Ukraine has created incidents in Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania. This is the new reality. Russia bears full responsibility for these acts and also consequences. This kind of reckless behavior is a direct threat to international peace and security, and we must act to stop it before such acts spiral out of control. We must counter these threats by resilience and increased cooperation with our friends and allies. But hybrid warfare is evolving, as are emerging and disruptive technologies. The challenge is to maximize the benefits these technologies can bring, while remaining vigilant of the potential risk they pose. We share the United Nations view that we need to develop artificial intelligence responsibly, but we should not halt the progress. Artificial intelligence can promote economic growth, drive scientific progress and innovation, even improve healthcare and make education more accessible. Artificial intelligence is already part of our daily lives. We must acknowledge this reality and work to make it safer and more beneficial for the people. The governments should not take years to create regulations. We should act swiftly and do it right. As a responsible United Nations member, a future UN Security Council member, Latvia is ready to work with our partners to address these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations has stood the test of time for 80 years. It is the primary architect of international law and protector of rules-based international order. The United Nations is not perfect, but it is the best we have, the only truly global organization. As one of UN Secretary Generals, Dag Hammarskjöld, famously said, the United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from the hell. But after 80 years, it is time to adjust to new realities. The United Nations must evolve to remain relevant, to be effective and fit for the challenges ahead. That's why we support the UN 80 initiative by the Secretary General. Let us work together for peace and resilience. Let us protect the rules-based international order and the United Nations Charter, because we all are better together. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Latvia. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency William Samoei Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya and Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madam President, the President of the 88th session of the UN General Assembly, Madam Annalena Baerbock, Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, Excellencies, heads of state and government, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I congratulate you, Madam President, on your election to preside over the 80th session of the UN General Assembly. Madam President, you can count on Kenya's full support throughout your tenure as you steer the Assembly into the future. Ladies and gentlemen, 8 years ago, in the aftermath of the unprecedented global destruction and devastating war, the international community came together in hope. They created this organization, the United Nations, as a shield against the horrors of war, as a platform for dialogue, and as a bridge to a better, fairer, more secure global community. What is often forgotten or not mentioned today is that the United Nations grew out of the failure of the League of Nations that existed between 1919 and 1945. The League of Nations did not collapse for lack of good intentions or noble objectives. Formed at the end of the First World War and as part of the Treaty of Versailles, it was humanity's first attempt to build a permanent international organization to stop aggression and war and bring nations together. Its ambitions were to achieve collective global security, disarmament, peaceful dispute resolution, and cooperation on humanitarian and social issues. Despite these ideals, the League of Nations failed. The United States never joined, other great powers came and went, and without enforcement authority, its condemnation carried little weight. When Japan invaded Manchuria, when Italy marched into Ethiopia, and when Hitler openly defied its rules, the League stood by, helpless and powerless. By the late 1930s, its credibility had collapsed, and with the outbreak of the World War II, it was rendered irrelevant. Madam President, this history is both a lesson and a warning. Institutions rarely fail because they lack vision or ideals. More often, they drift into irrelevance when they do not adapt, when they hesitate to act, and when they lose legitimacy. To remain relevant, institutions must be reimagined, must be reformed, renewed, and aligned with emerging realities. 8 decades ago, the founders of the UN sought to correct the failures of the League of Nations by creating a stronger, more inclusive organization anchored in the principles of, and I quote, "We the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war," end of quote. Today, we are gathered for the UN at 80. The question is unavoidable. Is the United Nations relevant to the demands of our time? Can it continue to serve humanity in the face of current realities? Or has it become a relic of a bygone era? Madam President, Excellencies, we meet against a grim global backdrop. Conflict rages in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and beyond. Climate disasters grow fiercer by the day. Inequality deepens, pandemics loom, and technological disruptions outpaces governance. Instead of trust, mistrust is spreading. Instead of solidarity, fragmentation is taking root. In place of hope, anxiety fills our global community. We are living, to borrow from the words of the founders of this institution, not in larger freedom, but in growing uncertainty. At this moment of turbulence, when we most need a strong United Nations, the organization faces its deepest crisis in credibility and capacity. Funding cuts have paralyzed its operations. Bureaucracy has slowed its response. The Security Council remains frozen in the post-war structures of 1945, unable to act inclusively, with fairness, and with speed. Ladies and gentlemen, I can, however, state with absolute conviction that the United Nations has been one of humanity's greatest achievements. For 8 decades, it has held back the specter of global war, calmed conflicts from Cambodia to Liberia, and stood guard in some of the world's most dangerous places through the courage of its peacemakers and peacekeepers. Few institutions in humanity's history can claim such a legacy. The United Nations has stood at the front lines of humanitarian crisis, from famine relief in the Horn of Africa to emergency shelter for millions of Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. It was at the forefront in the eradication of smallpox, coordinated global responses to HIV and AIDS, Ebola, and COVID-19, and continues to champion universal vaccination. Its agencies have advanced women's rights, protected children, safeguarded refugees, and set global norms on everything from disarmament to climate action. The UN Sustainable Development Goals remain a shared blueprint for human progress. These are achievements no nation could have achieved alone, however rich, however great, or however powerful. And yet, every institution, no matter how noble its origins or impactful its legacy, must adapt to changing times or slide into irrelevance. Today, the United Nations stands at a crossroads of renewal on one hand or decay on another. Put differently, after 80 years, the rhymes of time are calling on us to reimagine the original promise that inspired the founding of the United Nations, and that is the quest for global peace, development, and human rights. But this call must now be answered in a global context that is profoundly different from the post-war era in which the UN was conceived then. We would be denying the cold, hard truth if we say that the United Nations is delivering as it should. On peace and security, its voice is too often drowned by the rivalries of great powers, while some nations simply ignore its resolutions and do as they please. Too often, the UN's blue helmet, once a symbol of moral authority, no longer commands the same respect. From the conflicts in Gaza to Ukraine, to the crisis in Sudan, DRC Congo, Somalia, and the Sahel, we see actors proceed undeterred by the United Nations calls. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Kenya speaks from the experience of a nation deeply invested in multilateralism. For decades, we have placed our troops and police in harm's way for peacekeeping missions across Africa and beyond, from Somalia to Democratic Republic of Congo, from South Sudan to most recently in our neighborhood here in Haiti. Over the past 15 months, we are proud to have led the multinational security support mission in Haiti, not because it has been easy, but because solidarity is the essence of the United Nations. Madam President, the mandate of the MSS mission is coming to an end in a few days. As the lead nation, allow me to briefly share our experiences, the successes and the challenges, as both a cautionary tale and a living lesson about the strengths and weaknesses of the current global security governance architecture. For far too long, the people of Haiti called out to the world. Too often, their pleas were met with silence, hesitation, or half measures. Haiti became a tragic reminder of what happens when the international community looks away, prevaricates, or offers half-hearted support. When Kenya responded to the quest for the Haitian authorities, it was in the belief that we were joining a genuinely multinational effort. We welcomed and fully embraced Resolution 2699, by which the United Nations Security Council authorized the MSS with Kenya as the lead nation. Drawing on our decades of peace support operations, we stepped forward, stepped up, and deployed our officers to confront the rampant menace of gang violence in Port-au-Prince and its environs. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the mission has operated in a volatile environment under enormous constraints. It has been underfunded, under-equipped, and operated below 40% of its authorized personnel strength. Our police officers have valiantly shouldered responsibilities without the full logistical support that would accompany any mission sanctioned by the United Nations. Despite these challenges, and against all odds, the MSS has delivered results many thought were impossible. The presidential palace, once under siege from gangs, is today restored as the seat of government. The police headquarters and the police training center, once overrun by gangs, are now secure, with the academy resuming the training of new police officers, over 700 of whom graduated a few months ago. Schools that have been shattered by violence have reopened, with children back in class, learning and progressing. Roads once manned or blocked by gangs have now free-flowing traffic. Cases of kidnapping and extortion have reduced sharply. The airport and the seaport, once surrounded by gangs, are now abuzz with normal operations. Which begs the question, if so much could be achieved with limited resources and stretched personnel within just 15 months, what more could have been accomplished if the United Nations fraternity had truly acted together in solidarity with the people of Haiti? From this podium, I wish to assure all partners and actors that with the right personnel, adequate resources, appropriate equipment, and necessary logistics, Haiti's security can be restored. Gangs can be neutralized and the safety of streets, schools, hospitals, and homes secured. The continued harassment, abductions, and criminal acts undermining the lives of Haitians are unacceptable, unjustifiable, and must be stopped by this organization, the United Nations. Madam President, as the UN Security Council deliberates on the next steps, we must not lose sight of the fact that the situation in Haiti demands sustained, coordinated, and undivided international attention. A careful and orderly transition from MSS is essential to consolidate the hard-won gains so far achieved. I urge the Security Council and all partners to remain steadfast in ensuring that Haiti moves forward on a path of peace, stability, and renewal. Ladies and gentlemen, on human rights, our principle is clear and unwavering. The protection of civilians and respect for humanitarian law cannot be applied selectively. We cannot condemn suffering in one place and turn a blind eye in another. Kenya is gravely concerned by the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and by the immense suffering of civilians caught in the devastation of disproportionate military operations. At the same time, we call for the unconditional release of Israeli hostages. In line with the African Union and United Nations resolutions, we also call for a permanent ceasefire, for strict adherence to international humanitarian law, and for the launch of a credible political process. Only through such a process can the vision of a two-state solution be realized, where Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace, security, and stability. Kenya is equally deeply troubled by the worsening humanitarian situation in Sudan, where innocent citizens are caught in the crossfire of a needless war. We fully endorse the Quad, comprising Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, in affirming that there cannot be a military solution and that only political dialogue offers a viable path forward. We join the Quad in urging all parties, including SAF, RSF, and the external actors, to respect Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and firmly reject any attempts to divide the country, reaffirming our unwavering support for a unified Sudan for the benefit of all its people. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, those who look to the future with a clear vision know that climate change is not only the single greatest threat of our age, but also one of the greatest transformation opportunities of our time. The global stocktake has made it plain that the world is off track. Current national determined contributions are steering us towards temperature rises far beyond any safe threshold. This is the difference between survival on one hand and devastation for millions across the world on the other. Kenya and Africa are not passive victims of this crisis. We are taking bold steps showing that climate action is not only possible, but can also be the foundation for inclusive growth. We are building a climate resilient society by embedding adaptation into every sector, from agriculture and energy to infrastructure and livelihoods, to sustainable mining and artificial intelligence. This ambition is visible on the ground. Today, 93% of Kenya's electricity comes from renewable sources: geothermal, wind, solar, and hydro. We are expanding investments in e-mobility, climate-smart agriculture, clean cooking solutions, and green manufacturing. We are also pioneering nature-compatible solutions such as sustainable waste management and circular economy interventions. Africa, too, is uniting its voice. In 2023, in Nairobi, we hosted the inaugural Africa Climate Summit, where the continent adopted the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Action and Call to Action. Just 2 weeks ago, in Addis Ababa, Africa came together once more at the second Africa Climate Summit to reaffirm our commitment and strengthen our ambition for climate-positive growth. We declared Africa not just as a victim of the crisis, but as a source of solutions, with climate action driving economic growth, transformation, and job creation for our communities. Ambition, ladies and gentlemen, cannot stand on willpower alone. Implementing our new NDCs will require $56 billion. That is why we call on the global community to unlock the $300 billion agreed at Baku, and to accelerate negotiations towards the new 1.3 trillion goal under the Baku-Belém roadmap. Without affordable finance and without reform of the international financial architecture, the promise of climate action in Africa will remain constrained. Madam President, in the aftermath of World War II, the Bretton Woods institutions were created to stabilize the global economy and rebuild war-torn Europe. At that time, their design reflected the power and interest of the victorious nations, who were also their primary shareholders and beneficiaries. The IMF was tasked with upholding the gold standard exchange rate system, while the World Bank was established to finance Europe's reconstruction. Both have since evolved into development finance institutions, but their structures, decision-making, and governance remains dominated by wealthy nations. Today, the global context is vastly different. The global standard collapsed 5 decades ago, and Europe has long since been rebuilt. Yet, the governance of these institutions has not kept pace with needs of a multipolar world, especially the needs of poor and developing nations. The mismatch between shareholders and stakeholders has become starkly visible. For instance, during the IMF's recent allocation of special drawing rights, 64% went to wealthy nations. Just imagine, 64%. With little need for liquidity support. They didn't need the money anyway, but they got 64%. While the poorer countries received just 2.4%. What a disconnect. The imbalance highlights how the very institutions meant to safeguard global finance stability often perpetuate inequality and instability. I have argued, and I say it again, that the current global financial architecture punishes poor countries with high interest rates and enormous conditionalities while rewarding rich nations with lower interest rates and softer lending rates. Its rules, priorities, and allocation mechanisms consistently favor those already prosperous, while trapping vulnerable economies in cycles of debt, high borrowing costs, and inadequate access to emergency support and concessional funding. It is imperative to transform these institutions into genuinely independent, apolitical global bodies that their operations are aligned with their global mandate. Such a shift would democratize decision-making, restore credibility, and allow the IMF and the World Bank to serve all countries fairly rather than reinforcing old hierarchies. But Africa is not merely waiting for external prescriptions. We are taking bold and deliberate steps to strengthen our financial independence, safeguard our stability, and accelerate our development. Kenya, for instance, fully endorses the establishment of the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, launched with the Africa Union in February 2024. This alliance brings together our homegrown banks, Afrexim Bank, the Africa Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Bank, Shelter Africa Re, Africa Development Bank, Africa Trade and Investment Development Insurance, and ZEPRI, institutions that embody Africa's determination to mobilize resources, finance trade, and build resilience on our own terms. At the same time, the Africa Union is championing 3 transformative institutions: the Africa Central Bank, which will issue a single currency and free our trade from dependence on foreign money; the Africa Monetary Fund, positioned to stabilize our economies and give us true financial sovereignty; and the Africa Investment Bank, designed to mobilize resources for infrastructure, industrialization, and integration that Africa needs to rise. And to complete this vision, the Africa Credit Rating Agency, one that understands our realities, values our uniqueness, and tells our story with fairness and truth, has already been established. Excellencies, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, Africa also marks 20 years since the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, the 2 historic milestones that establishes the common African position on UN Security Council reforms. For 2 decades, Africa has spoken in one voice, demanding justice, equity, and representation in the highest organ of global governance. This demand, however, continues to be ignored, deferred, or endlessly debated to the detriment of both Africa and the legitimacy of the United Nations itself. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance while decisions about peace, security, and development are made without our understanding, without our perspectives, and without our voice. Africa's exclusion is not only unacceptable, unfair, and grossly unjust, it also undermines the very credibility of the United Nations, this organization. Africa dominates most of the Security Council agenda, provides some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeeping forces, and bears the heaviest costs of instability. Yet we remain the only continent without a permanent seat at the main table where decisions about our destiny are made. Africa deserves, ladies and gentlemen, at the very least, 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the right to veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. The world must understand that reforming the Security Council is not a favor to Africa or to anybody. It is a necessity for the United Nations' own survival. If the United Nations is to remain relevant in this century, it must reflect today's realities, not the post-war power arrangements of 1945. Madam President, despite the stated and evident weaknesses of the United Nations, it still remains humanity's best chance at global solidarity. No other institution has the universal legitimacy or convening power of the UN. From coordinating humanitarian relief in times of war and disaster, to mobilizing the global response to COVID-19, to driving consensus on climate change through the Paris Agreement, the UN has consistently shown that the world can achieve together what no nation can accomplish on its own, however mighty or great or powerful. As Doug Hammarskjöld, the UN's Second Secretary General, once observed, and I quote, "The United Nations was not created to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell." End of quote. That mission is as urgent today as it was 8 decades ago. At a time when conflicts are multiplying, when climate change threatens every economy, and when inequality is widening, the need for a functioning, credible, effective, and a multilateral system has never been greater. It is through the UN that nations have pooled resources to vaccinate billions of children, to protect refugees from through the work of the UNHCR, and to keep the peace in more than 70 missions across the world. Without the UN, these achievements, modest though they may sometimes seem, would not have been possible. That is why we must resist the temptation to give up on the UN or abandon it. We must make it fit for purpose, reform its structures, strengthen its mandate, and ensure its decisions reflect today's realities rather than the geopolitical map of a bygone era. As one of the hosts of the UN headquarters and the only one in the Global South, Kenya stands ready to do its part to enable the organization to go through this phase of renewal successfully as envisaged by the Secretary General under UN 80 reforms. In conclusion, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the 80th anniversary of the United Nations must be more than a commemoration. It must be a turning point for the organization. Let us seize this moment to reimagine and rebuild the UN into a body that commands legitimacy, responds with speed, and delivers justice for all. I thank you and God bless you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Kenya and Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces. The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Santiago Peña Palacios, President of the Republic of Paraguay. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President of the General Assembly, distinguished heads of state and government, distinguished ministers of foreign affairs, ladies and gentlemen. This is my third address to the United Nations General Assembly. It is without doubt an immense privilege and an honor to represent Paraguay in this magnificent forum, a country which may look small on the map, but is a giant in its spirit and potential. As I flew into New York from afar, I was thinking that I might begin my speech by sharing the joy that I feel at having the opportunity to tell you about the great things that lie ahead for Paraguay. However, the events of recent days and months make this simply impossible. Instead, with regret, I must begin by recalling the anecdote of the great German historian Theodor Mommsen, who, upon receiving the Nobel Prize in 1903, asked his audience not to applaud after his acceptance speech. "The times," he said sorrowfully, "are too grave for that." The years that followed fully confirmed his intuition. I believe exactly the same thing can be said today. Indeed, in recent times, we have witnessed that evil, radical ideologization, intolerance are unfortunately real and embedded in certain sectors of our societies. I remain shaken, saddened, and distressed by the shocking images of two cowardly and incomprehensible political attacks. First, intolerance and hatred which took the life of a great human being, Miguel Uribe, the Colombian presidential pre-candidate who was assassinated in public while touring a square, while on a national tour. Ghosts of violence which we thought were a thing of the past for our Colombian brothers and sisters. Second, we saw a young dreamer, Charlie Kirk, who was miserably torn from his wife and two children for one sole sin, defending his convictions and values with eloquence and courage. Both men, rather than resorting to violence to impose their ideas, chose the most civic and peaceful method possible: free, open, and frank debate, without evading controversial positions, yet always within a framework of respect. The ominous, macabre response must awaken us from our slumber of complacency. Dear friends, our values, our very way of life are at risk. The idea of democracy, that venerable and brilliant creation of Greek genius, which allows us to have a peaceful modus vivendi despite our differences, is currently in jeopardy. Therefore, in times when darkness seeks to extinguish the light, we must take a stand. This is no time to be timid. Either we stand on the right side of peace and reason, or we stand with violence and intolerance. Our children and grandchildren will not forget the stance that we took when faced with the immense challenge before us. That's why I wish to be very clear with you. Political violence is immoral, intolerable, and profoundly harmful. We must reject it without equivocation. So let's say loudly and clearly no to hatred, no to violence, and no to authoritarianism. We mustn't underestimate the gravity of what's happening These aren't isolated events, they are patterns. The situation has been worsening in light of political movements. There is polarization and extremism that were once subtly revealed in texts and speeches that are now today materializing in acts of real violence. There is a crisis of belief in institutions. Citizens simply no longer have trust. Our democracy, this is a democracy which for decades guaranteed the most basic human rights, embodied in that magnificent instrument, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the everlasting achievement of the United Nations system, is under siege from all quarters, both on the left and the right. And this, ladies and gentlemen, might be a path of no return. This crisis situation is the perfect breeding ground for authoritarianism, where democratic values are eroded. Authoritarianism, or its perverse twin, populism, replaces it. Paraguay views with great concern the restrictions on the exercise of fundamental rights, such as access to free information and freedom of expression in some sister countries. These are already palpable demonstrations that the crisis is real and far-reaching. Thus, regrettably, the situation in Venezuela has become truly alarming. Systematic violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms are being compounded by actions that are contrary to international law and the persecution of political leaders. The electoral process in July 2024 trampled the will of the Venezuelan people. 7 million Venezuelans have left their homeland. This is the largest migratory crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. In Nicaragua, meanwhile, the persecution of political opponents persists and is expanding aggressively. The situation of human rights and fundamental guarantees is dire. Entire religious orders have been expelled. Hundreds of Nicaraguans have been stripped of their nationality for the sole crime of dissenting. Even the Catholic Church is being persecuted, something that was once unthinkable in Latin America. Paraguay knows better than most the calamity of authoritarianism and dictatorship, having lived through the longest military regime on the continent in the 20th century. The scars of this have not yet fully healed. We therefore cannot and must not stand silent while our Latin American brothers and sisters suffer the same oppression that marked our own past. The crisis of democracy, friends, will not be resolved with an iron fist, nor with censorship, nor authoritarianism, much less so still with violence. We must resist these alluring impostors. As the Italian philosopher Norberto Bobbio said, crises of democracy are resolved in one way only, with more democracy.